There are 9 graves under the old oak trees at St. Michael's Cemetery in Charleston, South Carolina. The city's most important families won't talk about them. Each headstone has the name of a rich plantation owner who died between 1851 and 1855. They all died in strange ways, with sudden paralysis followed by what doctors of the time called merciful death. But in 1923, when the cemetery was being fixed up, groundskeepers found something terrible that city officials quickly ordered to be kept secret from the public. The wooden lids on each of the 9 coffins had deep scratch marks from fingernails, and the bodies were in positions that made it look like they had fought hard. What the authorities found next would haunt Charleston's elite for generations. A leather journal buried beneath the cemetery's oldest magnolia tree, written in the careful handwriting of a man named Solomon Fairfax, detailing 4 years of calculated revenge that began with a family's screams and ended with 9 men buried alive. Before we go on with the story of Solomon Fairfax and the dark secret that turned a kind healer into Charleston's most methodical killer, we need you to join our community of truth seekers. Hit the subscribe button and the bell to get notifications so you never miss these hidden stories from America's past. Also, let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. We love hearing from people all over the country. The first entry in the journal, which was written on the 15th of March, 1851, started with a single line that explained everything. Today I watched my wife and children burn, and I did nothing to stop it. Charleston was the crown jewel of the Southern aristocracy in the 1852. White columned mansions lined the Cooper River, and fortunes made from rice and cotton built dynasties that thought they were untouchable. Charleston's medical community was small, but very respected by the wealthy elite who could afford to hire private doctors for their many ailments, such as mysterious fevers, sudden weakness, and strange paralytic conditions that seemed to affect the city's most prominent families on a regular basis. Dr. Cornelius Hathaway opened his practice on Meeting Street in 1845. He quickly became known among Charleston's upper class for his unusual knowledge of exotic remedies and innovative treatments. Part of his success came from his amazing assistant, Solomon Fairfax, a slave who knew almost everything there was to know about medicinal plants and chemicals. Dr. Hathaway bought Solomon just for his practice because he was so good at botanical medicine. His family had been healers on different plantations in the Carolina Lowcountry for generations. Solomon Fairfax was not like the other field slaves who worked on Charleston's plantations. He stood tall, and his smart eyes seemed to take in every detail of his surroundings. He had gone to school with the children of his former master and learned to read and write before such education was strictly forbidden. Even Dr. Hathaway was impressed by how well Solomon knew Latin medical terms. Dr. Hathaway had come to depend on Solomon's ability to make complicated compounds and help with delicate procedures. The rich patients who came to Hathaway's office got used to Solomon being there and often asked for him by name because of how kind he was and how well he seemed to understand their problems. But Solomon's life hadn't always been limited to the clean walls of a doctor's office. He had lived on the Pemberton plantation, which is 15 miles outside of Charleston, for 32 years before coming to see Dr. Hathaway. There, he married a woman named Celia and raised 3 children, 2 boys and a girl in one of the plantation's slave quarters. The Pembertons agreed to this because Solomon's ability to heal was very useful during the many times when fever and disease broke out and could kill a plantation's workers overnight. Solomon's skills had saved the lives of many people, both slaves and free people, which gave him a level of respect that was unusual for someone in his position. He had developed treatments for everything from snake bites to consumption. Using a combination of traditional African remedies passed down from his grandmother and new techniques he learned by carefully observing the white physicians who occasionally visited the plantation, the Pembertons even let him take care of their own family when they were sick, which showed how much they trusted his skills. This relative comfort, however, came to an end in March 1851, when Edmund Pemberton's gambling debts forced him to sell some of his human property to pay off his growing debts. Solomon's wife and kids would be sold along with him. They would be split up and sent to different plantations across the state. Plantation owners said this was necessary for business, but it broke up families just as badly as any natural disaster. Solomon begged Edmund Pemberton, saying that he would work extra years without pay if his family could stay together. He had even suggested other ways to make money, like working for other plantations during busy times, but Pemberton, who was being pressured by creditors to pay them right away, refused to talk about it. The sale was set for the 14th of March, 1851, at the Charleston slave market, and nothing could change that. It was gray and humid on the morning of March 14th, and storm clouds were gathering over the Ashley River as if nature knew what was about to happen. The night before, Solomon had held his family close in their small cabin, memorizing every detail of their faces and every sound of their breathing. He knew that when the sun came up, they would be separated forever. Celia, his wife of 15 years, had stayed calm during the whole thing and focused on getting their kids ready for what was to come. Marcus, the oldest at 8 years old, had inherited Solomon's intelligence and interest in the world outside the plantation. Samuel, who was 6 years old, had his father's kind nature and natural talent for healing. He often helped Solomon gather medicinal plants from the woods around their home. Grace, their 4-year-old daughter, clung to her mother, knowing that something terrible was about to happen, even though she didn't fully understand what was going to happen. Solomon watched helplessly as slave traders came to pick up his family and 6 other families that were being torn apart by Edmund Pemberton's financial desperation. The children's tears mixed with their parents' desperate promises that they would find each other again, somehow, someday, promises everyone knew were lies meant to make the pain less bearable. But the real horror started on the way to the slave market in Charleston. About halfway to the city, one of the wagon wheels hit a deep rut in the wet road, which made the wagon tip dangerously. Celia fell off the wagon in the chaos that followed and hit her head on a sharp rock that was sticking out of the road. Blood started to flow from the wound right away, and Solomon, even though his hands were tied, tried hard to get to her. The slave traders only cared about getting their goods to market in good condition. They made a choice that would haunt Solomon for the rest of his life. Instead of taking Celia to the doctor, they said she was a loss and told the wagon to keep going without her. Solomon screamed and fought against his restraints as they left his wife bleeding and unconscious by the side of the road. The other slaves held him back, though, because they knew that fighting back would only get them all in trouble. At the Charleston slave market, the nightmare got worse as Solomon had to watch his children being sold to different buyers. A rice farmer from Georgetown bought Marcus. He was known for using child labor to do the dangerous work of fixing irrigation systems in swamps full of alligators. A cotton farmer from the upcountry bought Samuel. Everyone in the area knew that he worked slaves to death. Grace was too young to work in the fields, so she was sold to a family in Savannah to be a house servant. She was lost forever in the huge network of slavery that connected southern cities. Solomon kept his outward appearance of resignation through all of this, knowing that showing any emotion or resistance would only make things worse. But on the inside, something important had broken. The man who had spent his whole life healing, saving lives, and easing pain watched as everything he loved was destroyed by the casual cruelty of men who thought of people as property that could be sold when it was convenient. Dr. Hathaway didn't know the whole story behind Solomon's tragedy, but he bought him mostly for his medical skills, paying a high price because Solomon was known as a great healer. Other doctors who had seen Solomon work at the Pemberton plantation had told the doctor about his skills, and he really needed someone who knew a lot about medicinal compounds to help him with his growing practice. As Solomon was taken away from the slave market to start his new life as Dr. Hathaway's assistant, he looked back one last time at the place where his family had been scattered to the winds. At that moment, something cold and calculating settled into his heart, a patience that would let him wait, learn, and eventually make those responsible pay a price that matched the size of their crimes. That night, alone in the small room above Dr. Hathaway's office that would be his new home, Solomon started writing in a leather journal that he had been able to keep hidden throughout the whole thing. His first entry, written by candlelight in the careful script he had learned as a child, began with words that would define the next 4 years of his life. Today I watched my wife and children burn, and I did nothing to stop it. But I'm still alive, and I remember every face, every name, every voice that laughed as my world ended. They think they have broken me, but they have only taught me patience, The months after Solomon came to Dr. Hathaway's office were a blur of routine medical procedures and careful watching. Solomon did his job well and quietly, just like he always did. He mixed compounds, set up treatment rooms, and helped with patient care. But behind this mask of acceptance, he was doing a very different kind of research. Getting to know the medical community in Charleston and the wealthy families who made up Dr. Hathaway's clients. Dr. Hathaway, a 50-year-old widower with no kids, had come to depend on Solomon's knowledge a lot. The doctor had arthritis, which made it harder and harder to do precise work. Solomon's steady hands and encyclopedic knowledge of how to make medicines had become essential to the practice. Dr. Hathaway had started letting Solomon handle some patient interactions on his own, which was more important for Solomon's plans. This was especially true when dealing with chronic conditions that needed regular monitoring and treatment. Charleston's rich elite, who were used to getting the best medical care, first saw Solomon with the same mix of casual indifference and condescending approval that they showed skilled slaves. But his clear skill and polite behavior slowly won him a level of trust that would be very important to his plans. Patients started asking for him by name, praising his gentle touch and seeming to know exactly what was wrong with them. During this time, Solomon carefully looked into the backgrounds of all the rich families that came to the practice. He learned about their business deals, their social lives, and most importantly, how they were involved in the slave trade that had ruined his family. He got a lot of information about the men who had taken part in or made money from the auction that sent his children all over the South by carefully listening and asking other slaves who worked in Charleston's big houses. His research showed that Edmund Pemberton was just one part of a much bigger system of exploitation. The Charleston slave market ran with the help and participation of the city's most respected citizens, men who served on church boards and charitable committees, while also treating people like animals to be bought and sold for profit. These were the men who went to fancy dinner parties to talk about philosophy and literature, while their wealth came from the pain of families like Solomon's. Solomon found 9 men among Dr. Hathaway's regular patients who were directly responsible for the destruction of his family. Some of them had been at the auction, bidding on people with the same lack of interest they would have shown when buying horses or cows. Some people had given money to the slave trade, lending it to dealers who made the most money by breaking up families. A few of them had bought slaves from the same auction that had sold his children. This was part of a system that saw people as disposable goods. As 1,851 turned into 1,852, Solomon started going through what he called his Education in Advanced Chemistry. Dr. Hathaway's medical library had a lot of books on pharmaceutical compounds, including detailed descriptions of different substances that could make someone paralyzed, unconscious, or look dead while they were still aware of what was going on. Solomon used these books, which were written for real medical reasons, as his textbooks in a plan for revenge. The most important discovery was in a book about South American plant toxins. It talked about a compound that came from a vine that grew in the Amazon basin, but had been grown successfully in a greenhouse by a Charleston botanist who sold rare plants to rich collectors. This specific toxin, when correctly administered, has the potential to cause total muscular paralysis while preserving the victim's consciousness and pain perception. To the outside world, the person would look dead, but they would be fully aware of what was going on around them for several hours before the toxin killed them. Solomon spent months learning how to find and grow the plant. He finally found some in the greenhouse of Dr. Hathaway's friend, Professor Nathaniel Crenshaw, who taught natural sciences at the College of Charleston. Professor Crenshaw was happy to find someone who shared his interest in exotic plants, even though he didn't know that Solomon was really interested in botany. He let Solomon help take care of his greenhouse collection. Solomon figured out the exact dose needed to get the desired effects by carefully testing it on laboratory mice. Too little would only make you weak for a short time. Too much would kill you right away. But the right amount would put the victim in a state that looked like death to anyone who didn't know a lot about medicine, while keeping them conscious long enough to feel the fear of being buried alive. Maybe even more discipline was needed to get his mind ready for what he was going to do than to learn the chemistry. Solomon had to keep being kind and helpful on the outside, while getting ready on the inside to see men suffer in ways that went against everything his healing nature stood for. He explained this change by looking over the names of his children in his journal every day to remind himself of what had happened to them and how the men who had sold them didn't care. As winter approached in 1852, Solomon had found his first target, Colonel Reginald Fitzpatrick, a rich rice planter who had not only been at the auction where Solomon's family was sold, but had also made fun of the children being sold and joked about how they could be bred. Fitzpatrick had chronic gout and went to Dr. Hathaway's office once a month for treatments that helped him feel better for a short time. The colonel was a perfect first target for Solomon's carefully planned revenge campaign because he saw Solomon regularly, trusted his medical skills, and always came to his treatments alone. But Solomon made himself wait, knowing that he needed to be patient and do everything perfectly to avoid raising suspicion and make sure that all 9 men got the justice they deserved. Solomon wrote detailed profiles of each of his intended victims in his journal. He wrote about their medical conditions, their treatment schedules, and their roles in the slave trade. These entries look like a doctor's notes, but they were actually a very different kind of treatment plan. It wasn't meant to heal anyone. It was meant to make sure that 9 men felt the same helpless terror that Solomon's children had felt when they were taken from everything they had ever known. The change from healer to methodical killer for Solomon Fairfax started with careful planning that lasted all of 1852. Every little thing had to be just right. Every possible problem had to be thought out, and every change had to be controlled. The men he wanted to kill were not just random people. They were pillars of Charleston society. Their deaths would be looked into by the city's top doctors and the police, who would be under a lot of pressure to find out why. The first thing Solomon did was make himself an important part of Dr. Hathaway's practice. He started coming in earlier each morning to get the office ready and staying later each evening to put away medical supplies. He was so dedicated to his work that Dr. Hathaway started to trust his judgment more and more when it came to medical issues. When Solomon had to take care of some patients on his own, without the doctor's direct supervision, this growing trust would be very important. It took him months of careful work to make his paralytic compound. Solomon grew the poisonous vine and tried out different ways to extract it while working in a small shed behind Dr. Hathaway's office. He said he was doing this to make herbal remedies that would help the doctor with his treatments. The process was risky. He accidentally exposed himself to small amounts of the toxin several times, which made him feel numb for a short time and gave him a terrifying taste of what his victims would go through in their last hours. The final form of the compound was a clear, odorless liquid that could be easily mixed with other drugs without being noticed. When given the right amount, it would start to work within 30 minutes, making the person feel weak and confused at first, which would be blamed on their current health problems. The victim would be completely paralyzed within an hour, but they would still be aware of everything going on around them and be able to hear, see, and feel it. Most importantly, the paralysis would be so severe that it would be impossible to find a pulse or breathing without very careful examination. In the 1,850 seconds, doctors didn't have the modern diagnostic tools we have now, so a patient who was treated with Solomon's compound would have looked like they died peacefully of natural causes. It would take a lot of knowledge about the toxin's effects to see the small signs that the victim was still alive but unable to move. It was both strategic and personal for Solomon to choose Colonel Reginald Fitzpatrick as his first victim. Fitzpatrick's monthly visits for gout treatment made it easy to plan around him, and his rude behavior made him even more annoying. More importantly, Fitzpatrick lived alone with house slaves who were afraid of him. This made it unlikely that anyone would want to have a long wake or a close look at his body after he died. Solomon had the perfect excuse. Fitzpatrick had gout and a weak heart, which Dr. Hathaway had been keeping an eye on for a few years. If Fitzpatrick died suddenly, heart failure would be the most likely cause of death, so there would be no need for an autopsy or further investigation. Colonel Fitzpatrick came in for his regular appointment on the 15th of December 1852. He said that his gout pain had gotten a lot worse in the past week. Dr. Hathaway was busy with another patient, so he told Solomon to get Fitzpatrick's usual treatment ready and start the consultation. This regular handing off of duties was just what Solomon had been waiting for. Solomon carefully added drops of his paralytic compound to the colonel's medication as he prepared it. Years of working as a doctor had taught him how to keep his hands steady and his face calm, even when things were stressful. These skills helped him make the switch from healer to killer. Fitzpatrick took the medicine without question or hesitation, because he was used to getting treatments from Solomon. Solomon would always remember the conversation that followed. As the poison started to work and Fitzpatrick began to feel weak, Solomon sat next to the colonel's chair and spoke to him in the same calm voice he always used with patience. "Colonel Fitzpatrick," Solomon said quietly, "I want you to know that my name is Solomon Fairfax, and you destroyed my family at the slave auction on March 14th, 1851. You laughed when my children were sold. You joked about how valuable they were as breeding stock. Do you remember that day?" Fitzpatrick's eyes, which were already glazing over from the paralysis, showed a flicker of recognition and then growing horror as he realized what was happening. He tried to talk and ask for help, but he couldn't because his voice and ability to move had been taken away. Solomon kept talking in the same calm, professional way. "Colonel, you're not dead yet. The medicine I gave you has paralyzed every muscle in your body, but your mind is clear. You can hear everything I'm saying and feel everything that's happening to you. In about an hour, Dr. Hathaway will examine you and say you died from heart failure. Your body will be prepared for burial, and tomorrow evening you'll be put in your coffin and buried in St. Michael's Cemetery." Solomon moved closer so that Fitzpatrick could see his face clearly. "But you won't really die until several hours after you're buried. You'll be fully aware of everything that's going on as the dirt is shoveled onto your coffin. You'll hear every sound, feel every sensation, and have plenty of time to think about what you did to my children. That's when you'll know what real fear is." The paralysis was now total. Fitzpatrick looked like a dead body, but Solomon could see the desperate awareness in his eyes and the frantic effort to somehow talk to or escape his paralyzed body. Solomon carefully checked the colonel's pulse and breathing, confirming that they were so weak that they couldn't be found without special tools. 5 minutes later, when Dr. Hathaway walked into the treatment room, he saw Solomon standing next to what looked like Colonel Fitzpatrick's body, looking concerned and sad. Solomon said quietly, "I'm sorry, doctor, but the colonel has died. His heart stopped while I was getting ready for his next treatment. He seemed to go very peacefully." Dr. Hathaway's examination confirmed Solomon's diagnosis. The colonel was dead, and since he had a known heart condition, it was clear what had happened. Within an hour, the body was removed to Fitzpatrick's mansion, where arrangements were made for a funeral befitting one of Charleston's most prominent citizens. Solomon went to the funeral and stood quietly in the area set aside for slaves while Colonel Fitzpatrick's coffin was lowered into the ground. When the first shovelfuls of dirt hit the wooden lid, Solomon wondered if Fitzpatrick was still awake and aware of what was happening to him. He didn't feel good about the thought. It just made him feel like justice was finally being served. That night, Solomon wrote in his journal for the second time, "Colonel Fitzpatrick has paid for his crimes. 8 more are still out there. Justice is patient, but it is also certain." Solomon waited to see if his method had raised any suspicion for months after Colonel Fitzpatrick's burial. People in Charleston social circles talked about how sad they were and how much they missed the colonel's work in the community, but no one asked how he died. Dr. Hathaway talked about the case with other doctors to show how quickly heart failure could kill even healthy people. Solomon's reputation as a skilled and caring medical assistant stayed strong. Solomon felt more sure about moving on to the second part of his plan after successfully carrying out his first revenge. However, he also had to deal with the mental effects of what he was doing. Even though he had planned everything out for years and was completely sure that his cause was just, seeing a man die in fear affected him more than he thought it would. He couldn't sleep for weeks after that, not because he felt guilty, but because he couldn't stop thinking about what Fitzpatrick had gone through in those last hours, buried alive. He had to think carefully about when and how to choose his second victim. Solomon had to make sure that there was no pattern that could draw attention to him. This meant changing both the time between deaths and the reasons they seemed to happen. His research had found that Judge Marcus Calverton would be a great second target. He was a man who not only saw the sale of Solomon's family but also argued in court that separating slave families was necessary for keeping order and making the most money. Judge Calverton had terrible migraines that had gotten worse over the past 2 years, which made him go to Dr. Hathaway more and more often. The judge's condition gave Solomon both a chance and a way out. People who have migraines sometimes have fatal strokes, and Calverton's old age made this a medically possible outcome. But before Solomon could carry out his plan against Judge Calverton, Something unexpected happened that almost ruined his whole revenge campaign. Dr. Hathaway said in March 1853 that he was thinking about hiring a junior partner. This was a young doctor named Dr. Timothy Henderson, who had just finished his medical training in Philadelphia and wanted to make a name for himself in Charleston's competitive medical community. Adding Dr. Henderson to the practice would mean that Solomon's actions would be watched more closely. There would be more witnesses to his interactions with patients, and it would be harder for him to give his paralytic compound without being caught. Dr. Henderson had also trained with doctors who were up to date on the latest developments in forensic medicine, such as how to find strange substances in dead patients. This is even more worrying. Solomon knew he would have to speed up his schedule by a lot. He would have to finish his mission in a matter of months before Dr. Henderson's presence made it impossible to keep going, instead of spreading out the deaths of his victims over several years as he had planned. He would have to take more risks and accept less than perfect conditions for some of his planned murders because his schedule was so tight. The need to act quickly caused Solomon to make his first big mistake. While getting ready for Judge Calverton's treatment in April 1853, Solomon accidentally gave him a little more of his paralyzing compound than he meant to. The judge's apparent death happened faster than expected, and the paralysis was so severe that even Dr. Hathaway noticed something strange about the body's condition. "Strange," Dr. Hathaway said quietly as he looked at Judge Calverton's body. "His muscles seem stiffer than usual for someone who has had a stroke. And look at his eyes. They look almost desperate." As he watched Dr. Hathaway do a more thorough exam than Colonel Fitzpatrick had, Solomon's heart raced. Solomon was scared for a few minutes that his whole plan was about to be revealed. Dr. Hathaway's medical training was very good for its time, but it didn't include the specific knowledge needed to tell what Solomon's strange toxin did. The doctor looked at Judge Calverton for 15 minutes and decided that the strange symptoms were just a result of his very bad stroke. Dr. Hathaway said, "Poor man must have suffered terribly in his final moments. He didn't know it, but he was describing exactly what Judge Calverton was going through at that moment. He was paralyzed, but aware, as his body was being prepared for burial." As a man who had served Charleston's legal community for more than 30 years, Judge Calverton's funeral had even more important people than Colonel Fitzpatrick's. Solomon stood in the slave section and watched as the judge's coffin was lowered into St. Michael's Cemetery, just 3 rows away from where Colonel Fitzpatrick was buried. As the funeral came to an end, Solomon saw something that made his blood run cold. A young man standing near the back of the crowd writing down notes in a small leather book. The person taking notes was Thomas Grimby, a journalist for the Charleston Mercury. He had started looking into what he called the prominent deaths phenomenon, a series of sudden deaths among the city's elite that seemed statistically unlikely. Grimby had seen that Charleston had lost a number of rich people to sudden medical emergencies in the past 6 months. These deaths were all medically explainable, but they all seemed suspicious when looked at together. Solomon wrote in his journal that night that he was becoming more aware that time was running out. Judge Calverton has joined Colonel Fitzpatrick in experiencing true justice, but I fear that others are beginning to notice patterns that could threaten the completion of my mission. I must work faster, even if it means accepting greater risks. Because Solomon's timeline sped up, he had to kill his 3rd victim in a matter of weeks instead of months. He chose Captain William Dandridge, a shipowner who had brought slaves from Charleston to markets all over the South. He had personally supervised the loading of human cargo with the same care he showed when handling valuable cotton shipments. Captain Dandridge was a difficult target. Dandridge was generally healthy and only went to Dr. Hathaway's office for minor injuries he got while working on ships. The other victims had chronic conditions and went to see Dr. Hathaway regularly. Instead of waiting for one to happen, Solomon would have to make one happen. Solomon's connections in Charleston's slave community helped him find the answer. Kitchen slaves who worked in the big houses along the Battery often talked to slaves from other households about what their masters were doing. Solomon found out through these unofficial intelligence networks that Captain Dandridge was going to host a dinner party for important people in Charleston's shipping community on the 20th of May, 1853. The dinner party would give Solomon the perfect chance to kill his 3rd victim while also learning more about possible future targets. Solomon often borrowed kitchen staff from other homes for these events. He had made friends with several slaves who worked in the kitchen. He could plan ahead to help serve dinner, which would give him direct access to Captain Dandridge and his guests. But while Solomon was working on the details of the dinner party, Thomas Grimby was looking into the recent string of high-profile deaths in Charleston. The journalist had started going to St. Michael's Cemetery on a regular basis to keep track of where recent burials had taken place and to write down the medical histories of the people who had died. What he found out would soon put everything Solomon had worked for in danger. The horror in Charleston gets worse just when we thought we had seen it all. Share this video with a friend who likes dark mysteries if this story is making you feel scared. Please like our content and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss stories like this one. Let's find out what happens next together. On the night of the 20th of May, 1853, Solomon Fairfax's planned revenge campaign came to an end. The dinner party at Captain Dandridge's mansion on East Bay Street brought together 12 of Charleston's most powerful shipping merchants. This gave Solomon a rare chance to study several possible victims while getting rid of his main target. Martha, an elderly slave who ran the kitchen for many of Charleston's biggest social events, had set up Solomon's participation. Martha was thankful for Solomon's offer to help serve the fancy meal because several of her regular helpers had gotten sick with a fever that was going around the French Quarter's slave quarters. She didn't know what Solomon really wanted. As Charleston's maritime elite gathered to talk about how to make shipping routes bigger and more profitable for transporting people, the captain's dining room sparkled with silver and crystal. Solomon moved around the room with practiced stealth, filling wine glasses and clearing plates, while listening to conversations that showed the casual violence that lay behind Charleston's economic success. Captain Dandridge, a strong man in his early 52s, with gray hair and hands that had seen a lot of sea time, sat at the head of the table and told his guests stories about profitable voyages and how to get the most out of slave shipments. Solomon thought he was especially despicable because he knew a lot about how to stop slave rebellions during transport and how to keep people alive on long trips. As the night went on, Solomon found a few more men who were involved in the slave trade and marked them as future targets. The conversations he heard showed that there was a network of people who were involved in his family's sale that went far beyond the traders who were directly involved. These men talked about people in the same way they talked about cotton prices or shipping schedules, as if the destruction of families was just a normal part of doing business. Solomon's chance came when the last course, a fancy dessert that needed to be made for each guest, was being served. Solomon carefully added his paralytic compound to Captain Dandridge's piece of brandy-soaked cake while working in the kitchen. He had perfected this method over the course of months of testing. The poison got into the dessert that was soaked in alcohol, which hid any taste and made sure that the victim's body absorbed it quickly. Captain Dandridge clearly enjoyed his dessert. He told Martha how well she had made it and asked for the recipe so he could make it himself. He started to feel the effects of Solomon's compound after about 30 minutes. He felt a little dizzy, which he thought was because of the wine he had drunk that night and the heat of the crowded dining room. As the paralysis got worse, Captain Dandridge got up from the table and said he needed fresh air to clear his head. Solomon, who was watching from the kitchen doorway, saw the captain go to his private study and fall into his favorite leather chair, just as the poison started to work. 20 minutes later, finding out that Captain Dandridge had died created the exact kind of scene Solomon had hoped to avoid. The captain didn't die quietly in Dr. Hathaway's office. Instead, he died in front of 12 witnesses, who immediately started asking questions. While the others watched in growing fear, Dr. Samuel Pettigrew, one of the dinner guests, looked at the body. "This is very strange," Dr. Pettigrew said after his first look. "Captain Dandridge seems to have had some kind of seizure, but there are no clear signs of apoplexy or heart failure. The muscle rigidity is very strong, almost like he had been poisoned." The word poisoned shocked everyone in the room and drew the kind of attention that Solomon had been trying to avoid. Within an hour, 2 more doctors had been called to look at Captain Dandridge's body. By morning, word of the strange death had spread through Charleston's social circles. Before dawn, journalist Thomas Grimby arrived at Captain Dandridge's mansion. He talked to servants and guests about the events of the night before, when the details were still fresh in their minds. His investigation showed that Solomon had been at the dinner party, which was the first time that anyone could be linked to more than one recent death of a Charleston elite. The net was closing in on Solomon, but he still had work to do. 6 of the people he wanted to kill were still alive, and the more attention he got, the less likely it was that he would be able to kill them using the methods he had already used. Solomon made the most dangerous choice of his campaign because he was desperate and knew his time was running out. He would try to kill several people at once, using a method that would scare them the most, even if it meant putting himself in danger of being caught. Solomon's research had found out about a private meeting set for the 15th of June 1853, when 6 of Charleston's most important slave traders would meet at Henderson and Associates offices to sign contracts for a big expansion of their businesses. The meeting would happen in the evening, after business hours, giving Solomon a chance to trap all 6 men in a small room. The plan he came up with was both brilliant and scary in how simple it was. Solomon worked at night for 2 weeks to make a lot of his paralytic compound in a very concentrated form. He was able to do this because he had access to medical supplies. He would not give the toxin to each victim one at a time. Instead, he would use the gas lighting system that lit up the office to put it into the building's air supply. The Henderson and Associates building had a central gas distribution system that sent gas to each lamp in the building. Solomon could make sure that everyone in the building would be exposed to deadly amounts of the toxin within minutes of the lamps being lit for the evening meeting by putting it directly into the main gas line. Solomon waited in the alley behind the Henderson and Associates building on the night of June 15th for the 6 men to arrive for their secret meeting. At 8, gas lamps lit up the office windows, showing that the meeting had started and Solomon's trap was being set off. The building was quiet in less than 30 minutes. Solomon waited another hour to make sure the paralysis had fully set in before using a copy of a key he had carefully planned to get into the building through the back door. The scene in the main conference room was both scary and satisfying. 6 men sat around a mahogany table, their bodies frozen in the positions they had been in when the paralysis hit. Their eyes, the only part of their bodies that could still move, followed Solomon as he walked around the room. This showed how scared and aware they were of what was going on inside their bodies. Solomon went up to each man, one at a time, and spoke to them in the same calm, professional way he had spoken to his other victims. He told them who he was and what was going on with them in a clinical way, explaining how they would stay awake during their burial and the hours of suffocation that would follow. The looks in their eyes, panic, disbelief, and desperate attempts to talk made Solomon feel good in a way that years of planning had not prepared him for. But Solomon's victory didn't last long. As he prepared to leave the building and allow the victims to be discovered the following morning, he heard footsteps in the corridor outside the conference room. Solomon's careful watching of the meeting showed that someone else was in the building who shouldn't have been there. The door opened to show Thomas Grimby, the journalist who had been looking into the recent string of strange deaths in Charleston. Grimby had been following clues that led him to believe that tonight's meeting was an important part of his investigation. He got there just in time to see Solomon standing over 6 dead bodies. Grimby said quietly, "So, it's true." His voice showed a mix of horror and relief. "Someone has been killing Charleston's rich and famous people one by one, and you're to blame." Solomon understood that his carefully laid plans had finally fallen apart. There was no way to explain why he was in the room or why 6 men who had been his targets died so conveniently. The journalist's investigation had led him to the same conclusion that Charleston's authorities would soon reach. Someone with medical knowledge and detailed information about the victims' schedules had been killing them in a planned way. "They ruined my family," Solomon said simply, not trying to deny that he was to blame. "They sold my kids like cows and left my wife to die on the side of the road. This is justice, not murder." Grimby's answer showed how complicated Charleston's racial issues are, even when there is clear crime. He was a journalist who wanted to tell the truth about the murders. He was from the South, so he knew how cruel the slave system was that made Solomon want to get revenge. The disagreement between these points of view caused both men to hesitate for a moment, which would change the course of their lives. "Those men in there," Grimby said, pointing to the paralyzed victims, "they're still alive, right? That's why their eyes are moving. You've done something to them that makes them look dead but keeps them awake." Solomon nodded, knowing there was no point in denying what was clearly true. "They'll go through the same things my kids did when they were taken away from everything they knew. They'll have hours to think about what they did, just like my family did on the way to the slave market in a wagon." Grimby wrote down the conversation that followed in his own journal, which was found decades later when his old house was being renovated. The journalist was torn between his duty as a journalist to expose a mass murderer and his understanding as a human being of the wrongs that had made that murderer. Grimby finally said, "I can't let you go on, but I can't ignore what made you do this. Those men were part of a system that treats people like property. They made money by breaking up families and selling children. In a fair society, they would have to pay for what they did." Solomon's answer showed the philosophical framework that had helped him plan and carry out his plans for 4 years. In a fair society, my family would never have been destroyed in the first place. Since we couldn't get justice through the law, I made my own justice based on what I learned from their system. The standoff between Solomon and Grimby was broken up by the sound of voices coming from outside the building. People were coming to check out the meeting for one of two reasons. Either they were supposed to be there, or someone had seen something strange happening in the building. Both men knew that the scene would be found in a matter of minutes and that Solomon's fate would be sealed. Grimby said in a low voice, "There's a back stairs. You could still get away. I could wait a few hours before telling anyone about this, so you could get to the country." But Solomon had already accepted that he would either be caught or killed on his mission. He had killed only 6 of the 9 men who had destroyed his family. 3 of them would live to benefit from their crimes, and the system that made those crimes would stay the same. With the same calm confidence that had guided all of his actions, Solomon said, "I'm not running. Let them come. Let them find out what I've done. Maybe when this story gets out, more people will realize that even slaves have limits to how much they can take without saying anything." The voices outside got louder, and there were also a lot of footsteps on the stairs in front of the building. Grimby made a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He chose to protect his story instead of Solomon. The journalist got into position to watch and record what happened next, making sure he could give a full account of Solomon's capture and the discovery of his victims. When Charleston City Police burst into the conference room, they saw something that didn't make sense right away. 6 well-known people sat still around a conference table. They looked dead, but they didn't show any of the usual signs of natural death. A slave stood quietly next to the table and didn't try to run away or fight back. Instead, he gave a full confession of what he had done and a full explanation of how he had done it. The chief constable recorded Solomon's confession and kept it in Charleston's criminal archives. It helped the police solve not only the deaths that happened that night, but also the mysterious deaths that had puzzled the city's medical community for almost 2 years. The method of administration, the selection of victims based on their involvement in slave trading, and the paralytic compound were all written down with the same methodical accuracy that had characterized Solomon's campaign of revenge. The trial of Solomon Fairfax was one of the most controversial legal cases in Charleston's history before the Civil War. This wasn't because there was any doubt about his guilt, but because his case raised moral questions about slavery, justice, and how far people can go. District Attorney Charles Rutledge led the prosecution and said that the case was just a simple murder. A slave who had killed 9 important people and needed to be put to death to keep society in order. The defense, which was chosen by the court and led by the unwilling lawyer Benjamin Crawford, had the nearly impossible job of defending a client who had confessed to several murders while claiming that those murders were justified by the systematic destruction of his family. Crawford's plan wasn't to say that Solomon wasn't guilty. Instead, it was to show how awful the slave system was that made people so desperate for revenge. The trial brought to light information about Charleston's slave trade that had been kept secret from the public, testimony about how families were torn apart, how cruel slave auctions were, and how enslaved people had no legal rights made people uncomfortable because they wanted to see slavery as a good thing. Charleston's wealthy people had to face the human costs of their economic system when Solomon gave a detailed account of watching his family fall apart while he couldn't do anything about it. The Charleston Mercury's coverage of the trial by Thomas Grimby caused a stir all over the South. Newspapers from Virginia to Louisiana printed his articles, which included long quotes from Solomon's journal and detailed descriptions of the paralytic compound. The tale of the slave who used his medical knowledge to get back at his owners fascinated and terrified slave owners all over the area. The scientific community was especially interested in the medical parts of Solomon's crimes. Dr. Hathaway was heartbroken to learn that his trusted assistant had used the practice as a base for murder. He gave a lot of information about Solomon's pharmaceutical knowledge and access to rare compounds. The discovery that slaves could have a deep understanding of chemistry and toxicology went against what people thought about their intelligence and led to discussions about whether it was a good idea to educate them. The 6 men who had been paralyzed in the Henderson and Associates building gave the most dramatic testimony during the trial. All of them had made it through their ordeal, but the level of horror they experienced depended on how long each of them stayed awake after they seemed to have died. Their stories of being paralyzed and fully aware while hearing their own death announced and funeral plans made gave a deep understanding of Solomon's revenge that legal arguments alone could not. Colonel Harrison Vance, one of the survivors, talked about the mental torture he went through. "I could hear everything, feel everything, but I couldn't move a muscle. When my wife cried over my body, I wanted to comfort her and let her know I was still alive. But I was trapped in my own body, completely helpless, while arrangements were made for my burial." If Solomon Fairfax wanted to show me what terror felt like, he did it beyond measure. The news that Colonel Fitzpatrick, Judge Calverton, and Captain Dandridge were buried alive while they were still alive caused a huge uproar that spread far beyond Charleston. Families all over the South started to wonder if their own dead relatives had really died of natural causes or if they had been poisoned in the same way. Charleston's doctors were overwhelmed by the number of requests for exhumations and post-mortem exams, which created a climate of suspicion that lasted for years. Solomon stayed calm and well-spoken throughout the trial. He didn't show any remorse for what he did, only that he couldn't finish his mission against all 9 of his intended victims. His last words to the court were a chilling summary of why he did what he did. "I was trained to preserve life and ease suffering, but when this society destroyed my family while calling it legal and proper, I learned that the same knowledge used to heal can also be used to ensure justice. I do not ask for mercy, because no mercy was shown to my wife and children. I ask only that when you condemn me, you remember that I am not the one who created the system that makes such revenge necessary." The jury took less than an hour to make their decision. Everyone knew that Solomon Fairfax would be found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death by hanging. This was because his crimes were so serious, and it was important to keep order in a society that held slaves. But the quick conviction didn't answer the moral questions his case had raised about slavery, justice, and the humanity of enslaved people. On the 15th of October, 1853, Solomon was put to death in front of a crowd of more than 2,000 people who had come to see Charleston's most famous criminal die. Thomas Grimby wrote down his last words, which he spoke from the gallows with the same calm certainty he had shown during his trial. They were published in newspapers all over the South. "I die knowing that 9 men experienced the terror my children felt when they were sold away from everything they loved. That knowledge makes my death worthwhile. But this system that creates such desperation will continue, and other families will suffer as mine did. When that happens, remember that even the most patient man has limits to what he will endure in silence." Solomon's body was buried in an unmarked grave outside of Charleston city limits because it is against the law to bury executed criminals in holy ground. But the authorities never got back his journal, which they took as evidence during the trial. Thomas Grimby, who had been allowed to look at the journal while he was covering the trial, had made many copies of its contents before giving the original back to the court clerk. Years later, when Grimby was writing his memoirs, he chose to bury Solomon's journal under the magnolia tree in St. Michael's Cemetery, close to the graves of the men Solomon had killed. The journalist wrote in 1889 that he made the decision because "I could not bear to destroy the record of such methodical revenge, but I also could not allow it to inspire others to similar actions. Perhaps future generations, with different perspectives on justice and slavery, will be better equipped to understand the terrible necessity that drove Solomon Fairfax to become both healer and killer." The discovery of Solomon's journal in 1923 during the cemetery renovation that revealed the scratch marks inside 9 coffins provided the final confirmation of a story that had passed into legend. The scratches made by fingernails desperately clawing at the lids of wooden coffins were proof that Thomas Grimby's story was true in every way. Charleston city government quickly labeled the find as sensitive historical material and locked up all records related to the case. The official reason given was worries about public safety and the possibility of racial tensions, but many people thought the real reason was to protect the reputations of well-known families whose ancestors had been involved in or profited from the slave trade. The revenge of Solomon Fairfax had effects that went far beyond the city of Charleston. During the antebellum South, slave owners grew more and more wary of educated slaves, especially those who knew how to treat illnesses or had access to drugs. New laws were passed to keep slaves from getting books, medical training, and scientific knowledge. This was because the authorities knew that education could turn the oppressed into dangerous enemies. The case also had an effect on how forensic medicine grew in the U.S. The strange paralytic drug that Solomon used led to research into ways to find strange poisons in dead bodies, which led to improvements in post-mortem examination methods that would be useful in future criminal investigations. But maybe the most important thing about Solomon's story is how it changed the national conversation about slavery. The discovery that even the most seemingly docile and loyal slaves could harbor years of accumulated rage called into question basic beliefs about the institution's stability and moral justification. What did it mean that Solomon Fairfax, a well-educated, skilled, and trusted slave, could plan and carry out such a methodical revenge? What did that say about how the millions of other slaves in the South really felt? This mystery shows us that even in the darkest times in American history, people who stood up against the system could change things that seemed unchangeable. The story of Solomon Fairfax reminds us that justice is not always denied. Sometimes it just takes a different, worse form. What do you think of this tale? Do you think Solomon's actions were right because they destroyed his family? Or was his revenge just another kind of evil? Please leave a comment below and let us know what you think about this scary story from Charleston's hidden past. If you liked this dark look at America's hidden history and want more stories that show what our ancestors tried to hide, subscribe now, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who likes to learn about the complicated truths that lie beneath our country's official histories. Remember that the past is never really gone. It's always waiting for someone brave enough to dig it up. Until next time.